The assassination of 24-year-old Big L is a documented history of lethal collateral retaliation. Just days before signing a major record deal with Jay-Z, Lamont Coleman became the target of a hit intended to punish his brother's gang disputes. On February 15, 1999, he was ambushed in his own neighborhood by a childhood friend. Shot 9 times in the head and chest, Coleman died instantly on the street. This is the cold reality of how street politics physically executed a musical genius. The physical geography of northern Manhattan in the late 20th century dictates a very specific, unforgiving reality for those born within its grid. A proper forensic examination of the environment that forged Lamont Coleman reveals the exact mechanics behind his brief, explosive life and brutal termination. Rather than serving as a passive historical backdrop, the neighborhood of Harlem in the 1980s and early 1990s functioned directly as a highly active predatory ecosystem. The economic devastation of the era, compounded by systemic neglect, had transformed the historic streets into a high-stakes combat zone. The heroin epidemic of the previous decade had decimated the older generation, but the introduction of crack cocaine completely revolutionized the mechanics of street violence. It created an incredibly lucrative, violently contested, illicit economy that operated entirely outside the bounds of traditional law enforcement. In the center of this chaos sat the intersection of 139th Street and Lenox Avenue, a localized epicenter of this chemical and economic warfare, famously and accurately dubbed the danger zone. Lamont Coleman was born into this precise environment on May 30th, 1974. As a child navigating the transition from the 1970s into the hyper-violent 1980s, he developed a survival mechanism that was entirely psychological. While other boys in the neighborhood were actively drawn into the physical mechanics of the drug trade, acting as lookouts, runners, or enforcers, Lamont adopted the role of the silent observer. He possessed an inherently analytical mind. Remaining physically detached from the daily violence, he instead watched the surrounding brutality with a chilling clinical precision. The corner of 139th and Lenox was his absolute universe, and he studied its inhabitants like a sociologist trapped inside a war zone. He absorbed the dialect, the posturing, the unspoken codes of retaliation, and the grim reality of young men bleeding out on the concrete before they reached their 20th birthdays. He began to process this immense daily trauma by channeling it directly into notebooks. He dissected the English language, mathematically structuring syllables and internal rhymes to perfectly capture the terrifying velocity of his surroundings. However, this quiet intellectual pursuit of poetry was completely contradicted by the terrifying reality operating inside his own home. The Coleman household was a pressure cooker of conflicting destinies. Lamont was the youngest, a gifted writer who needed a sanctuary to develop his craft. But the apartment was not a sanctuary. It was the nerve center for a completely different kind of neighborhood legend. While Lamont was filling notebooks with intricate rhyme schemes, his older brothers, Donald and specifically Leroy, known to the streets as Big Lee Finnezy, were actively dictating the violent politics of the neighborhood. Standing in stark contrast to his brother's artistic observation, Big Lee operated entirely as a ruthless, highly efficient street general. Leroy Finazzi was the recognized founder and undisputed leader of a notorious local syndicate known as the NFL Crew, an acronym that stood for Niggas for Life. Far beyond any loose affiliation of neighborhood kids, the NFL Crew functioned as a deeply entrenched, highly organized criminal enterprise, dominating the danger zone. Under Big Lee's command, the Crew controlled lucrative drug distribution territories, executed violent armed robberies, and maintained their authority through absolute unyielding intimidation. Big Lee possessed a reputation that sent a genuine chill through the Harlem underworld. He was fiercely intelligent, strategically ruthless, and possessed a massive capacity for violence. He did not issue empty threats. If the NFL Crew claimed a block, that block belonged to them, and any incursion by rival factions was met with immediate, overwhelming physical retaliation. This created a profound, deeply dangerous paradox for young Lamont. He was a brilliant, observant poet forced to share a dinner table with an active, highly feared warlord. The dynamic between the brothers was complex and bound by fierce, undeniable blood loyalty. Big Lee loved his younger brother, and Lamont loved him in return. But love in the danger zone is a highly toxic, double-edged sword. Because of Big Lee's terrifying reputation, Lamont was granted an invisible bulletproof umbrella of protection on the streets of Harlem. Nobody dared to touch Lamont Coleman, nobody tried to rob him, and nobody attempted to press him into a rival crew. The entire neighborhood understood the lethal mathematics of the situation. If you placed a single finger on Lamont, you would immediately trigger the absolute unrestrained wrath of Big Lee and the entire NFL syndicate. Lamont was permitted to walk safely through one of the most dangerous zip codes in America, completely insulated from the physical consequences of the environment. He could stand on the corner of 139th Street, watch a drug deal go violently wrong, and then retreat to his bedroom to write a brilliant 16-bar verse about it, knowing he was personally untouchable. This protection allowed him the necessary mental space to develop into the lyrical monster that the world would eventually know as Big L, but it was a catastrophic, fatal bargain. He was completely shielded from the immediate violence, but he was simultaneously permanently tethered to every single enemy his brother was actively creating. As Big Lee violently expanded the territory of the NFL Crew, he accumulated a massive ledger of blood debts across the borough. He was stepping on toes, severing supply lines, and ordering hits. Every time Big Lee eliminated a rival or humiliated a competing crew, he added another name to a growing list of individuals who desperately wanted him dead. And because Big Lee was highly insulated, surrounded by armed enforcers, and deeply embedded in the criminal underworld, his enemies began to look for softer targets. Lamont, the quiet rapper writing rhymes in the bedroom, was the softest target available. Lamont was entirely aware of this dynamic, but he possessed a terrifying psychological blind spot. He adhered strictly to the code of the streets, which demanded absolute, unquestioning loyalty to your blood and your crew. He did not distance himself from Big Lee's operations. Instead, as he began to forge his alter ego, Big L, he utilized the brutal reputation of the NFL Crew as the foundational architecture of his lyrical persona. He absorbed his brother's violence and translated it into audio. The horrifying, incredibly graphic imagery defining Big L's music, the casual references to extortion, drive-by shootings, and absolute ruthlessness stemmed directly from harsh reality, serving as highly stylized, rhyming documentaries of the exact operations his brother orchestrated downstairs. He was essentially wearing his brother's bloody reputation like a tailored suit. To the music industry executives and the suburban listeners who would eventually discover his music, Big L sounded like a terrifying, unhinged criminal mastermind. He sounded like the most dangerous man in New York. But in the physical reality of 139th Street, he was a civilian playing a highly dangerous game of dress-up. He was projecting the aura of a killer without possessing the actual sociopathy required to pull the trigger. He was a poet standing behind the shield of a warlord, completely oblivious to the fact that the shield was rapidly cracking under the pressure of 100 unseen vendettas. The streets do not differentiate between the man who gives the order and the brother who raps about it. In the unforgiving logic of the danger zone, blood is blood, and the debts accumulated by the NFL crew were slowly, silently being transferred directly onto the shoulders of the neighborhood's brightest rising star. The psychological insulation provided by his brother's terrifying reputation allowed Lamont Coleman to completely retreat into the architecture of language. When he stepped up to a microphone, the quiet, observant teenager entirely vanished, replaced by an entity that the New York Underground would soon recognize as a lyrical apex predator. Big L did not simply write rap verses. He engaged in a highly advanced mathematical deconstruction of the English vocabulary. In the early 1990s, the standard metric for hip-hop lyricism was largely defined by a rudimentary ABAB rhyme scheme, occasionally punctuated by a clever metaphor. Big L aggressively dismantled this standard. He introduced a level of multisyllabic compounding and internal rhyming that was at the time virtually unprecedented. He possessed the unique, devastating ability to string together 4 or 5 syllables that perfectly mirrored each other across multiple bars, while simultaneously delivering a narrative punchline that struck the listener with the blunt force of a physical assault. He weaponized humor, utilizing a darkly comedic horrorcore aesthetic that took the grim realities of the danger zone and twisted them into highly stylized, hyper-violent, theatrical performances. His cadence was razor-sharp, his breath control was clinical, and his delivery possessed a cold, unbothered arrogance that demanded absolute attention. The sheer magnitude of his technical proficiency became glaringly obvious upon examining the physiological reaction he provoked in his most elite peers. Nasir Jones, operating under the moniker Nas, was universally regarded as the golden child of the East Coast Renaissance. Following the release of the monumental album Illmatic, Nas was considered the undisputed technical benchmark for street poetry. He was a prodigy who had elevated hip-hop to high literature. Yet, when Nas was handed a cassette tape featuring early unpolished recordings of Big L, the reaction was not one of professional respect. It was one of genuine visceral terror. Nas later stated on the record that hearing Lamont Coleman rap literally scared him to death. This was not a hyperbolic compliment. It was the biological response of a supreme predator recognizing that a new, highly advanced species had just entered the ecosystem. Nas realized instantly that Big L was executing rhythmic patterns and structural combinations that the rest of the industry had not even begun to conceptualize. L was operating on a frequency that bypassed standard musical critique and tapped directly into a terrifying, raw genius. The definitive historical documentation of this absolute dominance occurred on the evening of February 23, 1995. The location was the cramped, sticker-covered studio of the WKCR radio station at Columbia University, home to the legendary Stretch and Bobito show. This program was the absolute mecca of underground hip-hop, the ultimate proving ground where careers were either forged or permanently destroyed on live, unfiltered radio. Big L arrived at the studio, operating at peak creative velocity. He did not come alone. He brought a relatively unknown, fiercely ambitious rapper from the Marcy Projects in Brooklyn to share the microphone. That accompanying artist was Sean Carter, known as Jay-Z. What transpired over the next 7 minutes is widely considered by hip-hop historians to be the most significant lyrical exhibition ever broadcast. It was a masterclass in contrasting styles. Jay-Z, at this stage in his early development, was utilizing a rapid-fire triplet-based flow. He was incredibly smooth, highly technical, and clearly destined for greatness, effortlessly skipping across the instrumental with the practiced confidence of a seasoned hustler. But when Big L leaned into the microphone, the atmospheric pressure in the room fundamentally shifted. L did not attempt to match Jay-Z's speed. Instead, he slowed the tempo down, delivering his bars with a heavy, methodical, devastating precision. He unleashed a barrage of punchlines so complex and so ruthlessly arrogant that they entirely eclipsed the surrounding performance. When L delivered the legendary bar, stating that he was so ahead of his time that his parents hadn't even met yet, he effectively ended the contest. The lyrical sparring was respectful, but the hierarchy was immediately permanently established. Jay-Z was a brilliant artist displaying massive potential, but Big L was the undisputed, terrifying master of the room. He completely absorbed the oxygen, leaving an indelible mark on the culture that is still dissected by lyricists decades later. However, the sheer brilliance of his talent did not translate smoothly into the rigid corporate machinery of the major label system. Following a highly anticipated bidding war, Big L signed with Columbia Records. The executives sitting in the glass panel boardrooms in Midtown Manhattan recognized his raw talent, but they completely failed to understand the cultural context of the danger zone. They attempted to package Lamont Coleman into a digestible, marketable commodity. When he delivered his debut album, Lifestyles of Da Poor Dangerous, the label fundamentally mishandled the release. They did not know how to market his dark, unapologetic street narratives to a mainstream audience. The promotion was severely lacking, the radio support was minimal, and the album, despite being universally hailed as a masterpiece by hip-hop purists, failed to achieve the massive commercial success the label demanded. Columbia Records, operating with the cold, unsympathetic logic of corporate accounting, subsequently dropped him from the roster. For an average artist, Being discarded by a major label is a fatal blow. It triggers a psychological collapse that usually ends a career. For Big L, it triggered a massive, aggressive evolution. He did not retreat into the shadows of Harlem. He recognized that the corporate infrastructure was fundamentally parasitic, designed to extract value from artists while maintaining absolute control over their masters. He immediately pivoted, utilizing the hustler mentality forged on 139th Street to completely bypass the traditional industry gatekeepers. He established his own fully independent imprint, Flamboyant Entertainment. This was a revolutionary move in the mid-1990s, an era when major labels held a virtually unbreakable monopoly on distribution and marketing. Big L became his own chief executive officer, his own AR, and his own distribution network. He pressed his own vinyl records, leveraging his massive street credibility to secure placement in independent record stores and DJ crates across the 5 boroughs. This era of extreme independence birthed his most culturally significant solo work. Operating without the censorship or the interference of a corporate AR department, he recorded and released the single Ebonics. The track was a conceptual masterpiece, a highly structured linguistic breakdown where L systematically translated the complex, hyper-localized slang of the Harlem streets into standard English. It was not just a rap song, it was an urban Rosetta Stone, delivered with flawless cadence over a heavy hypnotic instrumental. The record exploded. It achieved massive underground success, dominating college radio and mixtape circuits. By self-releasing the record through Flamboyant Entertainment, Big L retained absolute ownership of his intellectual property. The profit margins, previously siphoned off by the major label machinery, now flowed directly into his own pockets. He was generating genuine, independent wealth, proving definitively that he did not need the corporate infrastructure to dominate the culture. He was standing entirely on his own 2 feet, building an empire from the trunk of his car. As the calendar shifted into the early weeks of 1999, this massive independent momentum created a gravitational pull that attracted the absolute titans of the industry. The landscape of New York hip-hop had radically shifted. Jay-Z, the man who had shared the microphone in that cramped radio studio 4 years prior, was no longer an unknown artist from Brooklyn. Following the monumental multi-platinum success of Volume 2, Hard Knock, Life Jay-Z and his business partner Damon Dash had transformed Roc-A-Fella Records into a towering cultural and financial empire. They possessed an unmatched infrastructure for marketing, touring, and distribution, but Damon Dash, operating with a shark-like instinct for talent, recognized that their roster lacked the raw, terrifying lyrical precision that only one man in the city possessed. They needed Big L. The negotiations were swift, and the vision was highly ambitious. Roc-A-Fella was not merely offering a standard recording contract. They were proposing the creation of a massive, industry-dominating supergroup to be called the Wolfpack. The architecture of the group was designed to be an impenetrable lyrical fortress, featuring Jay-Z, Big L, and a select few other elite, hand-picked artists. It was a merger of supreme talents that would have entirely monopolized the East Coast market. For Lamont Coleman, this was the absolute culmination of his entire existence. The contract sitting on the table represented total permanent escape velocity. It was the guarantee of generational wealth, massive global distribution, and the ultimate vindication of his independent hustle. The paperwork was drafted. The lawyers had reviewed the terms. The ink was ready to dry. Big L was operating at the absolute zenith of his physical and creative capabilities. He had survived the brutal economics of the major label system. He had conquered the independent market. He was exactly 24 years old, holding the keys to the most powerful kingdom in hip-hop. A massive, luxurious celebration dinner was formally scheduled to take place in precisely 3 days. This dinner was not just a meal, it was the official coronation ceremony. The moment Lamont Coleman would officially sign the Roc-A-Fella contract and permanently transition from a Harlem neighborhood legend into a global superstar. The champagne was already ordered. The trajectory of modern music history was set to be radically altered. He was standing just 72 hours away from a life where the violence, the poverty, and the crushing paranoia of the danger zone would be nothing more than a distant, fading memory. The fatal flaw in the architecture of Lamont Coleman's life was not a lack of intelligence, nor was it a failure to comprehend the extreme danger of his environment. His tragic flaw was his rigid, unwavering adherence to a street code that was fundamentally designed to consume its disciples. In the hyper-masculine, fiercely territorial ecosystem of 1990s New York hip-hop, the concept of authenticity was the ultimate, non-negotiable currency. It was not enough to simply possess superior lyrical technicality. An artist was required to carry the physical weight of their neighborhood. They were expected to be a direct, unfiltered reflection of the concrete they walked on. Big L understood this dynamic perfectly. He utilized the terrifying reputation of his brother's syndicate, the NFL crew, as the foundational armor for his public persona. He was not a trigger puller, but he stood shoulder to shoulder with the men who were. He funded them. He provided the cultural soundtrack to their violence, and he wore their affiliation like a badge of honor. This blind, absolute loyalty created a catastrophic collision between his ascending trajectory in the music industry and the grim, inescapable gravity of the Harlem underworld. The danger zone did not respect the boundaries of the recording studio, and the violent politics of the street frequently bled directly into Big L's professional relationships. He carried the pride of 139th Street into every room he entered, completely refusing to bow down or compromise his territorial integrity for the sake of industry diplomacy. This unyielding posture generated severe, high-stakes friction with some of the most powerful factions in hip-hop. The most indicative example of this dangerous collision occurred during a highly volatile incident involving affiliates of the notorious B.I.G. At the time, Biggie Smalls was the undisputed crowning king of New York hip-hop, backed by the massive financial and physical infrastructure of Bad Boy Records. However, when members of Biggie's entourage crossed the invisible boundary lines into Harlem, the overarching hierarchy of the music industry was instantly superseded by the localized, unforgiving laws of the block. An altercation ignited, resulting in a chain being violently snatched from a prominent member of the Brooklyn crew by individuals closely associated with the NFL syndicate. In the high-stakes theater of the illicit economy, the theft of a chain is not a simple property crime. It is a profound, highly visible declaration of disrespect that demands immediate blood retaliation. A standard artist caught in the middle of this crossfire would have immediately utilized their industry connections to mediate the situation, apologizing to the bad boy camp to protect their career and their physical safety. Lamont Coleman entirely refused. Bound by the strict, toxic code of neighborhood loyalty, he stood firmly behind his crew. He projected an aura of absolute indifference to the threat, essentially daring the Brooklyn faction to cross back into Harlem to reclaim their property. This terrifying standoff did not result in an immediate war, but it created a massive, silent tension. It effectively isolated Big L from powerful segments of the industry, branding him as a highly volatile, uncompromising liability who prioritized street politics over corporate success. This localized friction extended deeply into his relationships with his own peers within the borough. Years prior, Big L had formed an underground supergroup known as Children of the Corn, featuring fellow Harlem prodigies Cameron, Bloodshed, and Murda Mace. They were a collective of brilliant, hungry teenagers determined to conquer the industry together. But the brutal reality of the music business shattered that collective vision. Following the tragic death of Bloodshed in a car accident, the group fractured. Mace took a completely different trajectory, signing with Sean Diddy Combs at Bad Boy Records. He traded the grim horrorcore aesthetic of the Harlem streets for shiny suits, massive pop crossover appeal, and multi-platinum commercial success. The divergence in their paths created a bitter, simmering tension beneath the surface of the Harlem hip-hop scene. Big L remained in the trenches, fiercely independent, raw, and highly critical of what he perceived as Mace's commercial sellout. The friction was not merely musical, it was deeply territorial. L viewed himself as the authentic voice of the danger zone, while Mace was parading a sanitized corporate version of Harlem to a global audience. This animosity generated a dangerous internal divide within the neighborhood, forcing local crews to quietly choose allegiances between the independent purist and the mainstream superstar. Furthermore, Big L had to navigate the intense, unyielding bravado required to stand next to his own musical family, the Diggin' in the Crates DITC crew, heavily anchored by Bronx heavyweights like Fat Joe. The Bronx and Harlem possess a long, complex history of territorial rivalry. While the DITC collective was a brotherhood in the studio, the inherent street tensions required L to constantly project absolute strength and dominance. He could never show a fraction of an ounce of vulnerability, transforming his pride into a heavy, impenetrable armor that simultaneously acted as a massive magnet for conflict. But the industry beefs and the localized rap rivalries were merely minor skirmishes compared to the catastrophic, lethal storm that was actively being manufactured by his own bloodline. The true source of the impending tragedy was not Lamont Coleman's lyrics. It was the unchecked sociopathic greed of his older brother, Leroy Big Lee Finazzi. The architecture of a street syndicate is highly fragile, relying entirely on the projection of absolute violence to maintain control. When Big Lee was ultimately apprehended by federal authorities and sentenced to a lengthy term in a maximum security prison, the operational dynamics of the NFL crew should have theoretically collapsed. Instead, they mutated into something significantly more dangerous. The concrete walls and steel bars of the federal penitentiary did not break Big Lee's grip on the danger zone. They simply concentrated his paranoia. Operating through a network of smuggled cell phones, coded messages, and fiercely loyal enforcers on the outside, Big Lee continued to orchestrate the violent mechanics of the NFL crew from inside his cell. He was a phantom general, completely insulated from the immediate physical consequences of his own orders. Stripped of his ability to physically survey his territory, his operational logic devolved into absolute ruthless greed. He began issuing commands that were violently destabilizing the neighborhood. He ordered his enforcers to aggressively tax rival drug operations, to muscle into new, fiercely contested territories, and to execute anyone who displayed the slightest hesitation in paying tribute to the incarcerated boss. The NFL crew, acting as the blunt, heavily armed instrument of Big Lee's paranoia, initiated a campaign of aggression that completely shattered the fragile ecosystem of the Harlem underworld. They transformed former allies into bitter enemies. They disrupted long-standing supply lines, infuriating massive, well-funded rival syndicates. In the brutal mathematics of the illicit economy, when you disrupt revenue streams and shed blood on the pavement, you generate a highly specific ledger of debt. You create a long, dark list of heavily armed men who have absolutely nothing left to lose and everything to gain by eliminating the source of their financial devastation. Big Lee was systematically building an army of enemies, but he was sitting safely in a federal cell, completely out of the physical reach of the retaliation he was provoking. The predators hunting the Finazzi family were frustrated. They could not reach the general behind the prison walls. They found it extremely difficult to cleanly execute the highly armed, highly paranoid top lieutenants of the NFL crew who were actively patrolling the blocks. Operating on the cold, unsympathetic logic of urban warfare, the retaliation strategy inevitably shifted away from the hardest targets and focused directly on the weakest, most visible point in the family perimeter. That point was Lamont Coleman. Big L was not a hidden figure. He was a highly recognizable, famous artist. He had a predictable schedule. He walked to the local corner store. He stood outside the barber shop. He was generating significant independent capital through flamboyant entertainment. But instead of utilizing that capital to execute a physical extraction, moving himself to a secure compound in New Jersey, or a highly monitored penthouse in downtown Manhattan, he funneled the resources directly back into the danger zone. He purchased luxury vehicles, heavy gold chains, and continued to financially subsidize the very crew that was acting as the primary catalyst for the impending violence. He was suffering from a massive, fatal psychological blind spot. Lamont Coleman genuinely believed that the aura of his ascending fame, combined with the terrifying historical reputation of his brother, made him a ghost on the streets. He believed he was completely immune to the bullets flying around him because he was the poet, not the shooter. He failed to comprehend that in a war dictated by blood and territory, The title of the victim is entirely irrelevant. The enemies of Big Lee did not care about multi-syllabic rhyme schemes, radio freestyles, or pending multi-million-dollar contracts with Roc-A-Fella Records. They only saw the bloodline. They saw the financial engine of the NFL crew walking the streets unprotected. Big L was actively, willingly standing in the exact center of a target painted by his brother, completely oblivious to the fact that the invisible safety net he had relied on his entire life had just been violently cut away. The human bonds forged within the hyper-violent architecture of the danger zone are not standard childhood friendships. They are trauma bonds, welded together by a mutual desperate necessity to survive a highly predatory environment. When children grow up navigating the exact same concrete grid, dodging the same localized violence, and witnessing the same systemic economic devastation, their relationship transcends casual proximity. They become an essential emotional infrastructure for one another. To understand the precise chilling mechanics of Lamont Coleman's demise, one must forensically examine the man who allegedly pulled the trigger. The fatal bullet was not fired by a rival rapper, a jealous industry executive, or a random, opportunistic predator. The origin of the execution was deeply, horrifically intimate. The trajectory of the bullet began with a man named Gerard Woodley. Within the specific geographic confines of 139th Street, Gerard Woodley was universally known by his street moniker, G Love. He and Lamont Coleman were not merely acquaintances, they were the absolute definition of childhood best friends. Though were forged in the exact same furnace, they learned to navigate the complex, unwritten laws of Harlem side by side. Before the record contracts, before the legendary radio freestyles, and long before the immense weight of the NFL syndicate dictated the politics of the neighborhood, Lamont and Gerard were simply two kids trying to map out a future in a zip code that historically denied its residents the privilege of old age. Their trust was absolute, built on a foundation of shared history that no outsider could possibly penetrate or comprehend. The most profound, irrefutable documentation of this brotherhood is not hidden in a police file. It is a piece of global commercial art. When Lamont Coleman successfully navigated the treacherous machinery of the major label system to release his debut studio album, Lifestyles of the Poor Dangerous, he made a highly calculated, deeply symbolic aesthetic decision regarding the album's cover art. In the hip-hop industry, the cover of a debut album is a sacred real estate. It is the visual introduction to the artist's brand and identity. Lamont did not stand alone in front of the camera. He explicitly required the presence of his immediate trusted circle. Standing prominently in that iconic photograph, immortalized on hundreds of thousands of CDs and vinyl records shipped across the globe, was Gerard Woodley. Placing Woodley on the album cover was not a casual gesture. It was a public, permanent declaration of loyalty. Lamont was broadcasting to the world, and more specifically to the streets of Harlem, that his impending global success would not alter his fundamental foundation. He was signaling that the men who stood with him in poverty would stand with him in wealth. Woodley was not just a friend. He was recognized as a structural pillar in the personal mythology of Big L. But the tragedy of the streets is that physical proximity and shared history offer absolutely zero protection against the sociopathic mandates of the illicit economy. The fracture that would ultimately destroy this brotherhood did not originate between Lamont and Gerard. It originated, as all localized catastrophes did during that era, within the shadow of Lamont's older brother, Leroy Big Lee Finazzi. While Lamont was utilizing his intellect to document the streets, Gerard Woodley was actively operating within them. Woodley was a significant, respected figure in the Harlem underworld in his own right. He was not a subordinate to the NFL crew. He was an independent operator navigating the same highly contested drug territories. This independence was a fatal liability in an ecosystem completely dominated by the extreme paranoia of Big Lee. When Big Lee was incarcerated in the federal penitentiary system, the operational logic of the NFL syndicate became aggressively territorial. Big Lee demanded absolute, unquestioning submission from every single illicit operator functioning within his designated boundaries. He required a financial tribute, a street tax, to ensure his authority remained unchallenged despite his physical absence. Gerard Woodley, possessing his own pride and his own established reputation on 139th Street, allegedly refused to bow to the dictates of a ghost. He refused to pay the tax. He continued his operations, implicitly challenging the absolute sovereignty of the NFL crew. In the cold, unforgiving mathematics of organized crime, an open display of defiance against a syndicate leader cannot be ignored. If Big Lee allowed Woodley to operate independently without consequence, the perceived weakness would instantly invite other rival factions to dismantle the NFL's territory. The response had to be immediate, absolute, and terminal. From deep within the concrete confines of the federal prison, utilizing a smuggled communication network, Big Lee issued a non-negotiable decree. The history, the childhood friendship, and the shared album cover were entirely irrelevant. Gerard Woodley had to be executed. This decree placed Lamont Coleman in a psychological torture chamber. The street code, which he so heavily glorified in his multi-syllabic rhymes, suddenly demanded an impossible soul-crushing toll. He was caught between the two most powerful forces in his universe: the absolute biological blood loyalty to his older brother and the deeply entrenched historical brotherhood he shared with his childhood best friend. Lamont was a poet, an intellectual, a man standing on the absolute threshold of securing a multi-million-dollar contract with Roc-A-Fella Records. He had absolutely no business involving himself in a localized assassination plot, but the toxic gravity of his environment allowed for no neutral ground. To deny his brother's order would be perceived as an act of treason against his own blood and the NFL syndicate, instantly stripping away his physical protection on the streets. Trapped in this agonizing paradox, Lamont made a fatal, irreversible submission to the street code. He agreed to facilitate the mandate. He refused to serve as the physical executioner. While he had spent years meticulously architecting a public persona saturated in neighborhood violence, the tangible reality of assassinating his closest childhood confidant crossed a psychological threshold. He was entirely incapable of breaching, forcing his involvement strictly into the realm of logistical coordination. To ensure the hit was completely untraceable to the local Harlem factions, a highly calculated strategy was deployed. They could not use a local shooter, as the neighborhood network would instantly identify the assailant, triggering an immediate localized gang war. Instead, a specialist was outsourced. A hired gun was brought in from the borough of Brooklyn, an individual entirely unknown to the residents of 139th Street. The logistics required someone with intimate knowledge of the target's movements, habits, and exact location to guide the outside shooter directly to the prey. Lamont Coleman, possessing years of intimate historical knowledge of Woodley's daily routines, assumed the role of the navigator. He became the wheelman. The exact timeline of the evening the ambush was executed remains buried in the unwritten, bloody history of northern Manhattan, but the mechanical details of the operation were a catastrophic failure. Lamont drove the vehicle containing the hired Brooklyn assassin deep into the familiar grid of his own neighborhood. They located Gerard Woodley. The vehicle approached the target. The windows were lowered, the weapon was drawn, and the immediate environment erupted into chaotic violence. The assassin opened fire, attempting to execute the federal mandate. But the street is not a controlled environment, and the execution was severely botched. The bullets missed their lethal marks. Woodley, operating on the hyper-vigilant survival instincts forged in the danger zone, evaded the gunfire. The physical assassination had failed, but the psychological devastation inflicted in the immediate seconds following the gunfire was infinitely more destructive than a fatal bullet. As the chaotic echo of the gunshots faded and the getaway vehicle aggressively accelerated to flee the scene, a singular, horrifying moment of clarity occurred. Gerard Woodley, surviving the ambush, looked directly at the fleeing car. He looked through the glass, past the hired shooter from Brooklyn, and locked eyes directly with the driver. He saw Lamont Coleman. The psychological impact of that microscopic fraction of a second is impossible to overstate. It was the absolute instantaneous annihilation of a lifetime of trust. For Woodley, the realization was apocalyptic. He understood immediately that the attempt on his life was not a random robbery or a standard territorial dispute with a rival crew. He realized that the order had come from the absolute top of the NFL hierarchy, from Big Lee himself. But infinitely more devastating was the realization that Lamont, the boy he grew up with, the artist he supported, the man whose album cover he proudly adorned, had actively driven the executioner to his front door. In that exact moment, the brilliant multisyllabic lyricist known as Big L entirely ceased to exist in the eyes of Gerard Woodley. The childhood friend was dead. The artist standing on the verge of global superstardom was irrelevant. Lamont Coleman had actively participated in an attempt to permanently end Woodley's life, and by doing so, he had entirely forfeited his own. The failure of the assassination fundamentally altered the power dynamic of 139th Street. Gerard Woodley was now a dead man walking. He knew with absolute certainty that Big Lee and the NFL syndicate would not simply accept the failure and move on. They would regroup, reload, and continue to hunt him until the federal mandate was successfully executed. Woodley was trapped in an impossible situation. He could not reach Big Lee, who was heavily insulated and physically protected behind the maximum security walls of a federal prison. He could not retaliate against the head of the snake. Therefore, operating strictly on the cold, unforgiving mathematics of street survival, Woodley made the only tactical decision available to him. If a warlord orders your death from behind an impenetrable fortress, you do not attack the fortress. You attack the warlord's most highly valued exposed asset. You inflict the maximum possible psychological and emotional devastation upon the man who ordered your execution. Lamont Coleman became the ultimate proxy. He was the softest, most visible target in the Finazzi bloodline. He was the rising star, the financial engine, and the beloved younger brother. The silent, non-negotiable death warrant was officially signed the moment Woodley recognized Lamont behind the steering wheel. The hunt was instantly reversed. The protected poet was no longer insulated by his brother's terrifying reputation. He was actively condemned by it. The chilling reality of the subsequent weeks was that Lamont was entirely unaware of the proximity of his own death. He continued to navigate the streets of Harlem, finalizing the paperwork for the Roc-A-Fella supergroup, selecting beats for his next independent release, and preparing for the massive celebratory dinner that would officially mark his transition into a multimillionaire. He believed that the failure of the hit was simply a tactical error that the NFL crew would eventually rectify. He did not comprehend that by participating in the ambush, he had personally handed the executioner the exact coordinates of his own demise. He was walking the concrete of the danger zone, a condemned man, actively hunted by a ghost from his own childhood, who now possessed the ultimate justifiable motive for absolute, unrestrained revenge. The atmospheric conditions of northern Manhattan in the middle of February are notoriously brutal. The winter wind off the Hudson River funnels through the concrete corridors, dropping the temperature below freezing and forcing the residents of Harlem to retreat behind locked doors and thick glass. On the evening of February 15, 1999, Lamont Coleman was insulated from this bitter cold, sitting inside his apartment at 45 West 139th Street. He was entirely enveloped in a profound, quiet sense of triumph. The grueling, agonizing marathon of his career was functionally over. He had survived the treacherous landscape of the major label system. He had successfully built a highly lucrative independent enterprise from nothing. And now he was resting precisely 72 hours away from the official public validation of his genius. The massive multi-million-dollar Roc-A-Fella contract was drafted. The Wolfpack supergroup with Jay-Z was a reality. The celebratory dinner was booked. He was standing on the absolute peak of the mountain, looking down at the world he was about to conquer. Inside the apartment, the technology of the late 1990s dictated the rhythm of his communication. He was actively engaged in a rapid, continuous conversation via a two-way alphanumeric pager. The individual on the other end of the digital transmission was Omar Credle, professionally known as OC, a fiercely respected lyricist and a deeply trusted brother within the Diggin' in the Crates collective. Bypassing any discussion of impending millions or the corporate politics of the Roc-A-Fella merger, they engaged entirely in the pure fundamental work of the artist. They were dissecting concepts for a brand new track. The specific title and the thematic core of the song they were debating in those final hours is a detail so saturated in tragic irony that it defies conventional logic. The track they were conceptualizing was titled "Streets Don't Love Me Back." This title was not a casual collection of words. It was a profound, chilling psychological confession from a man who possessed a terrifying clarity about his own environment. Lamont Coleman was a highly observant genius. Despite his rigid adherence to the neighborhood code and his outward projection of invincibility, his subconscious mind clearly recognized the fatal flaw in his existence. He understood the parasitic nature of the danger zone. He knew that he had poured his entire soul, his financial resources, and his lyrical brilliance into elevating the mythology of 139th Street to a global audience. He loved Harlem fiercely, but he recognized with a creeping, undeniable dread that the concrete grid possessed absolutely no capacity for empathy. The block does not care if you are a poet or a drug dealer. It is a machine that consumes human lives. He was actively debating the nuances of this exact fatalistic reality with O.C., completely unaware that the physical manifestation of that reality was actively assembling outside his front door. At approximately 8:30 p.m., the continuous flow of pager messages was abruptly interrupted. A phone call breached the quiet sanctuary of the apartment. The mechanics of urban assassination are heavily reliant on psychological manipulation. A target like Lamont Coleman, a man deeply affiliated with the notorious NFL syndicate, a man who had recently participated in a botched assassination attempt, and a man acutely aware of the rising lethal tensions in his neighborhood, does not casually stroll into the dark on a winter night. If a stranger or an unrecognized voice demanded his presence on the sidewalk, his highly developed survival instincts would immediately lock the deadbolt and secure the perimeter. He had to be lured out. He had to be drawn from the fortress. To bypass a lifetime of street-forged paranoia, the executioners deployed the ultimate devastating tactic, the Judas kiss. The voice on the other end of the telephone did not belong to an enemy. It belonged to an individual Lamont explicitly, implicitly trusted. It was a mutual acquaintance, someone deeply embedded in his inner circle, utilized as a pawn in a much larger, darker game of retaliation. The caller requested his immediate presence downstairs to handle a quick, localized matter. Because the request came from a trusted source, the heavy defensive armor that Big L wore to survive the streets was entirely deactivated. He made the fatal decision to agree. He put on his heavy winter coat, preparing to brave the freezing temperatures for what he assumed would be a brief, routine interaction. He left the safety of the locked apartment. He descended the stairwell of the building. He was completely unarmed, both physically and psychologically. He believed he was stepping out to engage with his community. He did not know that the failure of the hit on Gerard Woodley had successfully triggered a massive irreversible chain reaction, and that the lethal karma of his brother's syndicate had finally arrived at his doorstep to collect the debt. The heavy doors of 45 West 139th Street pushed open. The freezing air immediately hit his face. The street was bathed in the harsh orange artificial glow of the sodium vapor streetlights, casting long, deep shadows across the pavement. Lamont stepped out of the building. He looked into the cold night, expecting to find the familiar face that had drawn him out of his sanctuary. Instead, the trap violently, flawlessly snapped shut. The executioner emerged from the shadows. The physical distance between the predator and the prey was closed with terrifying speed. There was no exchange of words. There were no dramatic cinematic speeches or explanations of motive. The street code does not provide closure. It provides absolute violence. The assailant raised a high-caliber semi-automatic weapon, bypassing any concept of sending a warning or crippling the target. The absolute intent of the ambush remained terminal erasure. The absolute deafening roar of the gunfire shattered the quiet Harlem evening. The violence was not random. It was a clinical, highly concentrated barrage. 9 consecutive shots were fired at point-blank range. The placement of the rounds dictated the profound depth of the hatred and the absolute necessity of the execution. Multiple heavy-caliber bullets tore directly through his chest, instantly destroying his vital organs. Additional rounds struck him directly in the head and the face, permanently and violently shutting down the most advanced, brilliant lyrical mind of a generation. The sheer volume of the gunfire was an act of overkill, ensuring that the target had absolutely zero biological chance of survival. The physical collapse of the giant was immediate. Lamont Coleman, exactly 24 years old, fell backward onto the freezing concrete of the exact same street he had spent his entire life documenting. The blood of the poet rapidly pooled onto the pavement of the danger zone. The executioner, having successfully fulfilled the dark mandate of the neighborhood, instantly dissolved back into the shadows of the Harlem grid, leaving a catastrophic, unimaginable void in his wake. The immediate aftermath of the gunfire presents an image of staggering, heartbreaking devastation. As Lamont lay bleeding to death on the cold concrete, deep inside the pocket of his heavy winter coat, his pager continued to vibrate. OC was still actively sending messages, entirely oblivious to the fact that his brother had just been slaughtered. OC was sending brilliant lyrical concepts to a corpse. In the span of 60 violent seconds, the entire trajectory of modern music history was permanently derailed. The Roc-A-Fella contract, representing millions of dollars in global domination, sat on a polished mahogany desk in Midtown Manhattan, waiting for a signature from a hand that was now lifeless on the pavement. The massive celebratory dinner scheduled for 3 days later instantly, horrifically transformed into a funeral arrangement. The neighborhood had reclaimed its most famous son. The violent, uncompromising ecosystem of Harlem had demanded its ultimate sacrifice, proving with chilling, absolute finality that the title of the song was a perfect prophecy. The streets did not love him back. They completely consumed him.